Welcome everybody, and I guess welcome to GDEX overall. That's awesome to kick it off. I guess we got an appropriately named presentation as well to go with that. So this is sort of a behind-the-scenes look at what eventually became known as Agents of Mayhem. When Chris and I and Cody and I were talking about, putting this together, I knew I had a ton of stuff to show, but sort of slapping this fancy title on it was sort of the hardest part. So I figured, let's call it what it really is, and we'll jump right in and just kind of look at some cool shit. Don't throw things at me. All right, so who am I? I'm Marcus Cenci. I've been making games for a while now. I'm a senior artist at Deep Silver Volition currently, but I've had a lot of roles and responsibilities kind of over my career. All of that time, the 15 years, has been spent at two companies, which are Volition and EA. I'm currently focused on outsourcing art with a lot of our partners around the world. But I was also part of the new IP team within Volition that was sort of charged with coming up with what was next for the studio. So 7 of us basically got locked in a room for a year with the task of coming up with a multi-million-dollar franchise, right? No pressure there whatsoever. If you're not overly familiar with Deep Silver Volition, the name's sort of confusing. There really should be a hyphen in there. Deep Silver is our publisher. They're sort of best known for publishing the Dead Island franchise. And Volition is the studio. So much like EA is the publisher and Tiburon is the studio, Deep Silver is our publisher, Volition is our studio. We're a 240-person team in Champaign, which is about five-hour drive from here. We've got a lot of people that work off-site, 2 of which just happen to work 3 miles from here in Upper Arlington, which is in Columbus. That's me and my wife, basically. So Deep Silver is basically known for, or best known for, the Saints Row franchise. We did a couple other things dating back to Free Space and Summoner and Red Faction, but Saints Row has kind of been our bell cow franchise. And if you were also paying attention to the E3 announced stuff, we're also the studio that's putting out Agents of Mayhem. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Basically, we're going to walk through the very, very early stages of our new IP to show you kind of how we got started. What are the earliest things that kind of fell out of our head and landed on a table and we argued about and figured out what we wanted to do. Hopefully this gives you some insight into our approach, and it allows you guys to draw parallels to your own work, because I think a lot of our process and a lot of our steps are directly relatable and directly applicable to any title, any game, any size development team. So I hope that you can apply some of these tools, some of these methods, and not only are we going to look at some cool shit, you guys can use this to help inspire what you guys are working on. So that's my hope. We'll see. So how are we going to look at this stuff? What are we going to talk about further? We're going to look at very early discovery phase things, how we got organized, how we got our ideas out of our heads, how we talk to each other, how we focused the things, and how we narrowed in on things that started to feel like tangible visions for a game. We'll look at some very, very early pre-pro examples where we worked to define what exactly we were making, where we set the overall tone of the game, where we refined the core of those ideas, and basically and ultimately how we sold the dream to the other 200 and some odd people in our studio and tried to convince our publishers that this was a good idea. And after all of that kind of stuff, I guess we'll wrap it up and kind of see how this thing kind of pieced together. And we'll take a look at our really fucking badass trailer that came out around the E3 timeframe. Hopefully it's badass. I think it's badass. I do have one major caveat to all of this. Since the title isn't out yet, there are some things I definitely can't talk about. There's definitely some things I can't show. So at the end, if we start asking questions and I feel super dodgy, I'm not being a dick. is because marketing will kill me if I talk about this stuff. So this is still a work in progress. Next year, I'll have the floodgates open and we can talk about a lot more of this stuff, hopefully. So one of the first things we did as a studio is we took a very serious and honest look at ourselves as developers. Saints Row 3 had just finished. Saints Row 4 was just about to kick off into production. There was another console switch on the horizon, and we really needed to take stock in our abilities as a developer. And what ultimately we came out with was what we called the Volition Special Sauce. And this was really just a set of guidelines that tied into our strengths, the culture we wanted to have as a studio, what players we wanted to attract, our competitive strategy over a 10-year period, and a kind of an inventory of what our tool set really could be. And really, that's just a long way of saying it's stuff we're good at, and we should do more of it. We came out with a lot of statements, so let's take a look at those really quick. I'm not going to read through all of these words. There'll be a lot of slides with a lot of words. I'm going to breeze through them because there's nothing worse than somebody sitting here reading line for line what's written. So what I really like about these early statements that we put together is they're written from the user point of view. And they act as a reminder to make us always remember that the player comes first. And that the end user experience and everything that we do, whether that's a feature or a character or a franchise, is all about our end users. And that should drive us forward no matter what. And it's ultimately what we should measure success by. So this is where we started to kind of jump in and start brainstorming. We had the special sauce sort of defined, which was kind of this, sort of heady, obscure thing. So we needed to start drilling in and figure out what it was. So the new I team was essentially, like I said, locked in a conference room and told to have at it. We knew that special sauce was meant to drive everything forward. So everything that we threw out there needed to fit within that sort of box that was already defined for us. It was the foundation that we needed to build on. So we came up with the idea of really, really short statements, just enough information to get the point across. So when we're talking to each other, it was more about an idea than it was a really solid, formalized pitch. And if you're familiar with the notion of an elevator pitch, it's kind of the 5-second pitch that you have. If I get on an elevator with you and we're traveling from one floor to another, I better be able to explain the idea to you in that amount of time. Otherwise, it's either too complicated or it's not direct enough. So we worked to really kind of drill down to the core of the idea we were trying to get across. We really wanted to focus on super rapid development. The idea was to do things fast and cheap, with the idea of generating a lot of ideas in a very short amount of time. It was also at this time we made the decision to not bring a concept artist onto the team and spend a lot of time fighting over the visuals. We moved to more of an approach where we're using found media and inspirational things to kind of piece things together to manipulate that into, when I say this, I mean that type of approach. We also set up a pretty hard rule that nothing was off limits. Just because we made Saints Row and Red Faction, a sci-fi and an open world, gangster kind of game, that didn't mean that that's what we were going to do. We had the special sauce to define the boundaries, but anything could fit in there, and we covered a very wide variety of different ideas. So as we worked through this process, and we've gone through a few of those pitches, we ran into some very consistent questions that we found ourselves asking over and over and over again. They helped to provide some contextual and visual information, and those questions turned out to be, who are you, meaning who are the player, where are you in the world, what do you do in that world, and who else is in that world with you? Now, on the surface, these questions seem incredibly basic and very straightforward and sort of kind of like no shit. Those are the things you ask yourself in a game. But what we found is that these were very loaded questions, and each one of them had a very strong subset of things, everything from features to narrative to co-op decisions. Like everything was in there that was a very loaded question, and it forced us to really take a hard look at the pitches and answer some very tough visual, gameplay, and feature set questions. We also quickly realized that as we worked through those questions, things could be really boiled down to 3 aspirational statements. And you'll see that throughout this presentation, that we sort of talked a lot, came up with big wordy things, and then tried to boil that down into more digestible formats. So we really pushed to work top down, set a foundation, and build on top of that. I kind of use the analogy with everything that I do, whether it's explaining long division to my son or talking about games. All of this is about, it's sort of like building Jenga. You have to have a sturdy base before you put the next thing on top and the next thing on top of that. Otherwise, shit's going to fall down, right? So as we worked through those questions, we realized that really the 3 aspirational statements we were talking about were, I want to be that person, I want to go do that thing, and I want to visit that world, basically. So I want to be them, I want to go there, and I want to do that. And if we could look at something and feel these things to start coming through, we knew we were sort of onto something. So at this point, I'll kind of fast forward and hand wave a bunch of hiccups that we ran into. Our publisher went bankrupt at this time, so even at a big studio, there's all these other things that kind of the smaller indie guys kind of run into as well. So I'll kind of fast forward all the bumpy waves there, but once things sort of settled, we narrowed in on what eventually became known as Agents of Mayhem. So it was originally a pitch to do a Saints Row reboot, and it sort of morphed over time and kind of pushed away from the Saints Row franchise and focused more on it being in the Saints Row world, but not directly a Saints Row game, if that makes sense. Hopefully it makes a little more sense as we move forward. So why AOM? Why did we pick that? We had 12 or so pitches that we really put a lot of time into, and it sort of kind of congealed into these big giant pitch boards that we put together, and we put them out for the world to see, and or the studio to see. And it quickly became noticeable that when we started to fill in the answers to the questions that we were asking, that AOM really jumped off the page to us. The answers were pretty great, and even at the earliest stages, the characters, the setting, the gameplay, and the franchisability just leapt off the page. So it really felt like a no-brainer. But really, above all else, we just happened to have one of the concept artists did this on the side and helped this person with the pitch. And it was really this concept piece that everyone started to gravitate towards. And it was pretty obvious that people felt this was very aspirational. They wanted to be this guy, and they wanted to run down a wall and shoot G.I. Joe trouble bubbles. That's awesome. But on top of all of that, it really seemed like when we asked those questions, the special sauce was dumped kind of all over this pitch, which sort of sounds kind of gross now that I say that out loud. Sorry about that. So we started to tried to narrow the focus. At this point, we felt pretty comfortable that we had a very high-level idea. We felt like we had something to sort of dive into. But we quickly realized we couldn't. And we tried to dive deeper, but there was a big roadblock. And that roadblock turned out to be that this picture meant very different things to everyone who looked at it. And that's basically people looking at it from a tonal point of view. Some people thought this was super serious. Some people thought this should be a parody because we've done a lot of fart and dick jokes in the past with Saints Row. People felt like it should be an M-rated game, and some people felt very strongly that it was a G.I. Joe sort of E for everyone kind of approach. So we really needed to kind of take a step back. And I mentioned that we were using a lot of inspirational pieces at the time, so we felt like we really had to kind of analyze the inspiration that we were looking at. So we decided to spend some time to really kind of dive into and talk about a lot of the things that we were kind of going over in our heads. We asked ourselves, if this was our game, would this show, if this was our game, what works from this show? If this is our game, what doesn't work from this movie? And basically, we were trying to narrow the box. So when people were talking about Archer, what did we want to pull from Archer? When people were talking about Mission Impossible, what is it that they were actually talking about? We actually had a lot of presentations, like people were coming in and like, here's the world of Venture Brothers, and they went through and presented like, here's how Venture Brothers can turn into our type of game. So we really analyzed things and put things together, and when we pulled a lot of that stuff together, there was just a bunch of it. So we came up with this notion that we'd put everything into these tones and spectrums in order to better show how on point things were when we were discussing them. The primary focus was on the overall tone, because you could see from that last slide that the confusion wasn't so much about, I want to run down a wall. It was the contextual tone that running down that wall was sort of put into. It was focused on humor levels and action moments, because really that's where people were tripping up the most and getting the most confused through it. So as we sort of talked through those discussions and comparisons, we eventually came to the conclusion also that we're really talking a lot about the characters in the world, and that the characters for this game were going to define and make up the world that we were trying to create. Above everything else, the characters mattered the most. So we also came up with spectrums, who are our heroes, who are our villains, and the idea was the closer to the center of it was, the closer and more on point it was. We also talked a lot about how these characters need to contrast. What are the differences between a villain? What are the differences, and how do they contrast against a character that's supposed to be a hero? So really, in short, we're trying to define the edges of our box. So that's where I talk about we start with this high level, and we're starting to narrow. So we started with the studio vision, now we're talking about the game's tone overall, or the franchise's tone, I guess, too. So, like I said, we're defining the X. But when we put all of this together, no matter how many notes, how many explanations, how many meetings we had to talk about this stuff, we very quickly found that this stuff was great for in-depth discussion with our small group, but without that deeper knowledge, a lot of this was getting lost when we showed it to other people, which is super bad. No one could really grasp all of this. And looking at it now, it's sort of obvious, like it's just a bunch of words and pictures of other people's stuff. But at the time, it was really, really helpful for us to get on the same page, but other people coming in, whether we got a new team member or we're talking to the publishers, they kind of looked at us and scratched their heads, which is, super no bueno at all. So this sort of brings up a good point overall about knowing who your audience is and being agile overall. If your message isn't getting across or it's getting lost, change the delivery of that message. It's something that I encourage highly. So that's where we turn to, enter the tone video. Some companies call this an animatic. Some people call it a sizzle video. But what this was really about was, making a lot of the inspiration our own, trying to boil this down into a movie-style trailer that you could quickly go, I want to do that. So it's basically made up of, existing music. I added some new titles to it, but these are really just captured clips that focus on characters, humor, action, and pace that we would find in our game. And it's really just me in After Effects capturing shit on YouTube and sort of piecing it back together to hopefully create something that gets all of that information across to other people in a format that we're really familiar with. So let's just kind of take a look at that.
Do you have any hobbies?
When I was little, I collected human ears.
Good times.
Let's move. World ain't saving itself.
Welcome to Moscow. You're not helping.
Oh! Are you sure you've done this before?
Okay, right now, not the time.
I'm warning you.
I am a lethal killing machine.
It was a secret government experiment. They did stuff to me. Spooky stuff. Anal stuff. Turned me into a dangerous telekinetic. Telekinetic a way out of this. Boom! Thank you.
And it went over really, really well with people. And it proved to be really the first time that people outside of our group and within the studio looked at something and said, I want to make that game. And it quickly realized that, you know, without a ton of words and all that other kind of stuff we went through, we were getting our point across. So we felt like we had everybody on the same page with the tone and humor, and we were able to start defining the core of the game a little bit further. And out of all of that discussion, out of the tone video, all the other things, sort of spilled what we called the player experience. You know, a lot of studios will call this the X. If you've worked at EA, it's called the Razor Statement. It's really meant to kind of cut through everything and become sort of the mission statement overall for the game. And for us, it turned out to be run a no-holds-barred G.I. Joe-style operation to battle a shadow evil supervillain organization in a modern cosmopolitan city. That supported all of our pillars, that supported the tone we were trying to get, and it really kind of cut through to the point, basically. So having this statement as opposed to all of that other information turned out to be really great. Now, it eventually got rewritten over time to be something a lot more fancy, but I'm just going to stick with the original a little bit here and kind of run through that a bit. So this statement became the game's overall high-level measuring stick when it came to just about everything: core features, story element, and the art style. Any early-stage ideas would be measured against this, and every time you kind of threw something out there, you would go back to this. Now, the danger in that is it kind of gets a little bit annoying when everything you say goes, but what about the player experience? But that's also a great check and balance system to have, and I think that's important for game development overall, is that you always are going back to something else. So when you talk about a new feature, it fits. You talk about the art style, it supports. You know, all of those things need to work sort of in harmony. So armed with the player experience and all the tone stuff, we felt like we were really ready to start moving into the concept phase. And we decided on taking the approach of the postcard mentality, which was pretty much lifted straight from a Destiny talk. It was done by Barrett and Stanton at GDC 2013. I won't go through a lot of that, but you know, if you have time to watch it, it's awesome. It's like 58 minutes, and it's full of great stuff. So if you like awesome things, go watch that. I've got a link to it if you want to grab me afterwards to kind of take a peek out of it. But the gist of it is really, you're trying to capture a snapshot of the game. And that's important to note that it's regardless of style, regardless of story elements. You're looking at a piece of concept that is true to us, but you're not worried about, well, is this exactly the cartoon style we're going to? Are we going for realism? You don't want to get lost in that. You don't want to start critiquing two different things at once. So we really kind of just said, ignore all of that stuff and let's focus on, could this be a snapshot from our game? And it really was a good opportunity to put all our materials to the test, because a lot of our concept artists were off-site. Actually, all of them were off-site for part of this. We had one internal guy, but he was in California, and then we started using a Russian company to do a lot of stuff. So sending them just our package of information and seeing what we got back was a great test to see if we were kind of on point with what we expected to get back. So here's some of the things we started to see. It started to work out pretty well. Now, there were definitely some misses, but we started to see things we wanted to do. Characters we wanted to be, places that we thought would be awesome to go. Some were really aspirational, and like I said, some of them were pretty off base. That one's crazy noosehead lady is interesting. But like I said, it started to kind of piece together, and it really helped us sell the dream. We started to see things that were like, well, that could be a movie poster for our game, so we know we're on point. This one really hit the mark and was actually done by one of our Russian partners. So we saw this and we thought, you know what? They get it. They're coming into this, through time zones and language barriers and not having any of that sort of implied knowledge that we have, and they're producing this. I think we're starting to get somewhere. So we felt like we were sort of ready to kind of move forward. And at the same time that we were doing all this, we had a little small set of game designers kind of locked away, and they're doing their little squirrely designer kinds of things. And they sort of led an initiative to define user classes. And by user classes and player classes, I'm not talking about archetypes that are in the game. I'm talking about the players that are going to play our games. Who are we going to cater our game towards? And this was based on another talk and a lot of information that Quantic Foundry and Brain Hex put together. It's really interesting stuff, but this is a whole nother presentation. I'm not going to go through it. What it all really boils down to is defining players that will like the things that we're doing, and we should gear towards them. So real quick, the player types that we ultimately came out with were the rule breaker, the grinder, the customizer, and the collaborator. And these are the players that we wanted to try to capture. So everything we did needed to filter towards that from a gameplay experience standpoint. So changing gears a little bit, once we had all of that, we decided to take the postcards and really kind of move forward towards agent prototyping. We had already said to ourselves that agents define our world, so we felt like we needed to sort of start to define those a little bit more. Again, we didn't want to focus on visual style. We just wanted to say, is this someone that could live and play in our cities? Is this someone that could live and breathe in our stories? We also, as we always do with everything, we love our rules and we love our guidelines. We came up with another set of processes that would kind of help us in the agent creation process. And these were the agent attributes that I'll go over, and what was ultimately dubbed the ultimate test, which turned out to be pretty cool. It's got a silly name, but it was actually pretty cool. So what player attributes did we kind of go after? These were a set of reminders that were written from the viewpoint of us as developers, from the viewpoint of the agents themselves and of the players. And they were essentially meant to act as the mission statement for creating agents. Now there's a whole lot of words here, but what this can be really kind of boiled down to or kind of cut through to is that we're trying to create an emotional reaction to our agents, which is something that every game should really aspire to do. And sort of as a side note, one of my very favorite things about this poster that was put up on the wall was the very last thing. And it actually took a lot of discussion to get there, but the eventually pick your favorites. Like, I think that's a pretty powerful thing. So for me, an ensemble cast of characters, it's great if people gravitate towards different characters because it shows that you're hitting on something within that individual. If everybody likes or everybody hates the same dude, it really just means you've made a flat game. You've made one good character and not two. If everybody, could care less who they are in the game, you've essentially just kind of wasted your time and not made anything that anybody's aspiring to be. It's a little bit different if you're doing a single character type of game, but an ensemble cast really, really needs that. So like, if you're playing Uncharted, you damn well better like Nathan Drake. But the idea of something like choosing Snake Eyes over Duke or Sub-Zero over Scorpion as your guy means that you're having an emotional connection to that character, and that's pretty cool stuff. So we kind of came up with these statements that each of the characters needs to be able to serve as an action figure, a target for cosplay, and the focus of a spin-off. And what this is really talking about is the look, an emotional connection, because if you're going to spend time making a costume, you probably care about that person. The action figure is if I walk into your office and you've got an action figure on your desk or on your shelf behind your desk, you should be able to tell something instantly about that character. They're a juggernaut. They're a badass, I don't know, heavy gunner kind of thing. You should be able to read something very quickly off of that. And the spin-off is really talking about depth, and that talks to story. Now, it might not be something that's apparent in the first box or the first game, but the depth of the character or the potential depth of the character is just as important. If you think about like Boba Fett, dude had like 2 lines and became an icon, and he has all these comic books, and if we could capture just a little bit of that's good stuff too. So where did we start with early agent development? We started with really quick write-ups that focused on stories, abilities, or visuals, and they could come from any direction. So it allowed our writers to kind of create agents. It allowed our designers, it allowed our artists. So ideas could come from anywhere again, and they could start with anywhere, but they had to be supported by the other 3 sets. So we were really looking to create holistic characters that weren't just this character's all about story, or this is all about the gun that this guy uses. We wanted all those things to work together. Things could kind of pop out and be the lead for that, but they needed to be supported as well by the other things. So some of the ideas started to come from just core statements. If you didn't have a full story, cool combinations of things could lead to the start of a character, with the overall goal to generate wide exploration, using rough thumbnails and a variety of different approaches. We threw a lot of vague things at concept artists. We didn't necessarily define every little, the vest and the shirt and what type of weapon. We threw, kind of those core statements and got back some surprises. That definitely can go not so great. It can go really, really weird. Yeah, and sometimes, though, it can be awesome. And those things can really trigger things that you didn't expect, but are a good twist on the character. And it allowed us to really start to narrow in on things, because the bad is just as productive as the good. Knowing what you really don't like and what really sucks is just as good as, well, this is awesome, because you're narrowing. So talked about starting here and going here, that applies to agent development as well. It also allowed us to kind of refine, generate things like style sheets that were more specific, that allowed us to do focused iteration on things. And then once we were in that sort of, that refinement loop, it was a matter of sort of just kind of pushing and pulling those boundaries and looking at things and ultimately starting to come close to something that we could call, final. So final rough is a bit of an oxymoron, obviously, but it was all about getting to something or someone we felt lived and breathed in our world. And all the time, we always came back to that ultimate test. Everything was pushed towards that. Does a character like Liberty look like an action figure? I would buy it. I could see someone dressing up as her at Comic-Con. And does she have enough depth for a spinoff? Maybe, but the intrigue for me from this picture is actually there. So, it was put through that creation process, but it always came back to the things that we felt were the high level and most important of those. So the measuring stick is just as important as the final result. So here's a few examples of different style sheets and sort of the rough thumbnail process and the rough final concepts that we came up with some of these these agents. Proteus was this super weird androgynous transhuman guy who loved to self-modify his own body all the time, or its own body if he's androgynous. Persephone, you'll see her in the announced trailer. She's sort of the queen bee, the leader of the agents. And from there, we really kind of, once we had our process, once we sort of had a good flow to how we put things together and put our agents in order and how we got things going, we kind of went into like agent overdrive. We went ballistic and just started making tons and tons of these agents to really cast a wide net. We focused on sort of what our good guys are, which aren't really the greatest of guys. They're good guys, but not really. And then we focused on who they were going to fight, and we really just threw stuff out there. Now, some of these made it, some of these didn't. A lot of these got hacked together and melded into one agent from 5 different agents, story bits, and all visuals. But what was great about this is we were now able to start really cranking out a lot of people that we felt would define everything. But it really wasn't until we landed on Hardtack and Dr. Babylon that we really felt we had a solid cross-section and a good representation of each of the factions in our game. We finally had our good guy and we finally had our bad guy. So after all of those concept hours and all of those discussions, we felt like our game could be boiled down to Kimbo, the badass sailor man, and crazy Dr. Babylon guy. And these things would eventually become, like I said, the cross-section, but they would inform other aspects of our title. From these things, the weapons from Legion could be defined, the weapons from the agents of Mayhem would come across. Their environments, their interiors would start to come across from the shape language and the differences between the two. Their vehicles would be populated by the look of these guys. What would that sailor guy drive? I'd like to think it's like a boat on wheels, like a ducky, but who knows if that fits. But this allowed us to really push and pull those boundaries. And what this did, combined with a lot of the other key pieces, was allow us to really sell the dream. People saw the dream in these two guys. The I want to be them was really strong there. So this is where we really felt that we were onto something. Now, unfortunately, this is also right about where the line is where I can talk about things and I can't talk about things. I can show you a lot of generic agents, but I can't really show you a lot of the newer things that have started to come out, because we've got a marketing campaign that's sort of trickling out guys one at a time, and if I God forbid I spoil something and get my butt chewed on, I don't want that at all. So, you may also be wondering, what does this really look like? So it's a good question, right? It's a really good question, because this is also the exact same time that we started to ask ourselves that question as well. And it makes sense, because now that we had the world, now that we had these characters, we needed to know how the visuals would now support that sort of that mission statement that we came out with. But unfortunately, that's a very long presentation. Maybe at next year's GDEX, I can, kind of show you all the art that kind of went into it. Hopefully you guys find this stuff cool, and we can look at a lot more of it. So we did have a lot of discussions about style, but like I said, that's probably another 3-hour presentation just to talk about the art. I'm an artist, so I could talk about that stuff all day long. But what I can show you is some previs that kind of went along further down the pipe, stuff that is pretty much final and that really shows what the game became. It shows how the style was applied to things. This is all stuff that you'll see in the trailer, so there's no spoilers here, and it'll hopefully at least give you an idea of some of the things that went into all the trailer, all the work that's been done on the art side to kind of look at this stuff. I know this is fast, but I'm getting the 5-minute sign too over here. So So with that, I promised the trailer. So this hopefully puts kind of a ribbon on the whole talk. And you can kind of see where all of this stuff built up to, where all of this kind of came from, and what got funneled into when we announced it to the world at E3.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 0-point dynamo means energy for all, limitless and free. Limitless and free.
Looks like you found some trouble. All right, who needs killing first? Go get him, girl.
Bullets. Ha! I'll ask Jen. Your pathetic resistance is amusing. But I have better things to do. Ahoy, motherfuckers! You want this orb so much? Well then, you can have it!
Bubby! Any word from the studio? Actually, Maury, let me call you back. Sorry I'm late. Oh, gotta take this. Yo, stunt double!
Shit, man, where were you?
Seriously, Babylon got away.
Guys, you worry too much. The sequel just got greenlit.
Miss Brimstone, your so-called specialists just tore up downtown Seoul. We're paying you to raise an army of agents, not a street gang.
If you are getting cold feet, then go beg someone else to save the world from Legion. Otherwise, just sign the checks and shut up. A street gang? Hardly.
There you go. So that's it. I don't think we have much time for questions, but I think the people telling me to get out of here ran away, so if anybody's got anything, fire away. Otherwise, I'll be around, I'll be walking around, I'll be here for quite a while. If you want to catch me in the hall, you want to catch me out on the floor, I'll be around. So does anybody have anything? I think it's really important to kind of be really honest with yourself and take a look at what you do well. I mean, that's what we did, was look at the things that matter to you. You know, if you're a really good, stylized modeler, model stylized characters. If you're good at realism, pull off realism. I think it's important that you either know what your skill sets are or push your own skill sets into the areas that you want to take on. If, like I said, if you're not a good stylized modeler, learn about it. If you're, looking to craft, if you really love fantasy and you want to make a fantasy game, research the hell out of it. So I think it's about knowledge and about doing what you're really kind of good at, and then analyzing, what makes up those things and looking to apply everything you do towards that stuff, really. Sure. I think that's where it's the top-down wide approach comes in handy. Found media can be really anything, right? It can start anywhere. So I think that coming up with that box, making sure that box is wide enough to cover your basis is a good place to start. I don't think I ever felt confined in the early stages that we couldn't talk about sky pirates or we couldn't talk about 1970s detectives. But once we did, that's where that box started to narrow in. So having a bunch of different boxes, I guess, is a good way to kind of look at that. So I don't know. I don't know if that really directly answers, but I never really got the feel that we were trapped inside that box, other than the bigger statement of what the studio wanted to do. But I felt like that was loose enough to capture just about anything. Good? Yeah. All right, I got to shut up now. All right, thanks, guys.